Hey, welcome back to the Metropole Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is Down the White Nile, which is the second data pack in the Kitara Cycle. We just talked about the runner cards a couple days ago, so we have 11 corp cards to go through. Really good stuff. 11 is a big enough number, so we're going to jump into this without further ado. Timestamps are in the description below if you want to look for something in particular. Do not hesitate to jump around. So let's start at the beginning. This is some HB Ice. This is called Nightdancer, and it is a 6 cost code gate of 4 strength and has 2 identical subroutines, and they're pretty great. It says the runner loses a click, if able, and then you have an additional click to spend during your next turn. And this happens twice, and this ice is 3 influence. And oh my god, what a great way to start the corporation side of this data pack. This is a nuts piece of ice. Witchcraft to the nascent, beauty to the wise. Nescient? Maybe it's nescient. This is an ice with a built-in win condition, which is kind of wild. That's actually a really big deal. I think you can only say there's only one ice prior to this that had a built-in win condition. That would be Shinobi. Caps lock is on. That, in theory, if you hit this at a bad time, you could die. And this didn't really work out because it was expensive and you had to beat all the traces, so it's not the point. This is a win condition if the runner hits this at the wrong time and they can't break the subroutines. Because if that fires, the corp is going to have 5 clicks on their turn, and with 5 clicks you can do a lot. With 5 clicks, you can score a 4-2 agenda out of hand with no additional support, and that's kind of a big deal. That's a real big deal early in game. It's a real big deal late in the game. Early in the game, you can score an agenda that gives you an advantage early on, like spending 4 credits and score a corporate sales team after spending 6 to res this. You basically recoup all your costs. There's other really good agendas to score out. This shouldn't stop you. There's more things you can do with this, more agendas. But on top of that, you have things like you can even push this value a lot farther with a 5-click turn. With cards like Jeeves Model Biroids on the table, perhaps even a Biotic Labor, you can even just go score from hand a 5-3 agenda. And that's a really big deal if you want to close the game. There's a lot of 5-3s like this one to help you early in the game if scored. And if a runner face plants into a Nightdancer early in the game, and you have the Biotic and you have admittedly a lot of credits to do this with Biotic Labor, you're in a really good spot. On top of that, maybe a Mantigrid. I don't know. This is funny also, they technically work together if you lose clicks, which is kind of cool. And that's a really big deal. This ice, if you hit it at the wrong point in the time, you can make the corp can score agendas out of hand, and that's such a big deal. Even with a fast track, if I have a 5-click turn, you can fast track, install advance a Project Vitruvius, or any other 3-2 if you want to play Merger or what have you. Even, this is only a 3 influence card, you can play it out of faction. And that's such a big deal. This is an insane subroutine. Sure, and we're only talking about the second part of it, where you have an additional click to spend during your turn. This doesn't even talk about the runner loses a click. But even just having additional click is generally something that people spend a card slot and 4 credits just to play. Now, you don't have control over this. The runner's not always going to faceplant this. The runner's not going to run this always when you need to. The runner's going to be able to break this some of the times, which even makes it like a fine target for Marcus Batty, which is kind of cool. You're spending a Marcus Batty just to make it a Biotic Labor, and sometimes the runner loses a click. This is, again, a bit janky, but this is the idea of how good this ice is. You'd consider firing these subroutines. Now, even with 5 clicks, you don't have to only score agendas. There's other things you could do. Now, probably there's nothing as good as scoring agendas, but in theory, like, you can advance things a bunch and have some really mean effects. Lose 14 credits, runner, go ahead and do that. You could install and use a Melange Mining Campaign, Mining Corp. Not particularly that great, but when you start to be able to play a triple operation and have 2 clicks left, you're kind of in an okay spot. Now, that's the really big deal, how this ice has a built-in win condition, but also the runner does lose 2 clicks if they hit this at a bad time. If they run into this last click, they don't lose anything, sure, but you still gain the 2 clicks on your next turn, so there's no point in time where breaking this isn't basically a necessity, unless the runner's trying to Hail Mary maybe in the last couple turns of the game where I'm pretty sure they lost anyways. But while losing a click is good, I guess you can capitalize on it with certain cards. Seder Laboratories is probably the most obvious way. You can recur some cards. That's alright, I guess. I'm not a big fan of this idea, I'll be honest. You have other things like Heinlein Grid, which is a pretty big deal. If the runner face checks into this hoping it's a Biroid and then maybe you surprise them, this is a bit expensive, but they can lose their clicks and all their money and you gain clicks, which is a pretty big deal. On top of that also, it's nice to know, even with Nightdancer, 6 is on the heavier side of playable ice, I think. But even if you spend those extra 2 clicks, which you're probably not going to do, if you just click for 2 credits next turn, it's like this thing cost 4 in some weird argument. Also, a Kawa project has come out recently. If they lose clicks, it might be harder to steal it. Maybe you need to prepare that. Protect that with Strongbox. That's a big deal. On top of that, even having the runner lose clicks is really good when it deals with other ice, in front of other ice that you need clicks to deal with. Maybe it's Biroids and maybe it is Turing. Now, I think actually one of the biggest things about this ice, not only are the subroutines good, but it is really hard to play around, and that's because of a Fairchild 3.0. Now, Fairchild 3.0 is an amazingly punishing piece of ice. It ends the run, which is really good, and it's a face check. It's really, really punishing. The runner either has to lose 6 credits or trash cards or do some combination. And these ice both cost the same amount of credits, which is pretty good. So the question is, do you have room for both? And I think actually one of the things that makes Nightdancer the best is that Fairchild 3.0 exists. Now, 3.0 is now a restricted piece of ice, which means it's less common than it used to be. But the way that you play around Fairchild 3.0 is you run early in the turn. So if you do hit the Fairchild 3.0, you can click through it. Now, that's the opposite with Nightdancer. If you hit Nightdancer early in the turn, it's really bad for you. So you're in this weird position where now there's actually I don't think there's any very good thing to do face checking HB ice besides be able to break 4 to 5 strength code gates, which is actually a pretty difficult ask. And also, yeah, if you run through this last click, there's other things like a Kawa project that we just talked about, and no matter what, these subroutines are good, and that's a really big deal when you have runner loses click subroutines, because sometimes they're not fantastic. If you look at Enigma is still a good piece of ice, but sometimes you only have to break one of these. These subroutines are still good. Now, another big thing that you have to consider about ice, of course, is it's not going to be a face check all the time. Eventually, the runner's going to put down their breakers and break this. So how easy is this to break? It's generally a lot of times an economic calculation. It costs normally how many credits to break this. Is that worth putting in a deck based on how much you spent to res it? And Nightdancer is honestly not that bad at all. For Gordian Blade, which is not a particularly that common of an icebreaker nowadays, but is generally seen as a standard, it costs 4 credits to break Nightdancer, which is not insignificant. I think one of the best things is Black Orchestra, a very common breaker in the meta right now, breaks us for 6 credits, which is the amount that you spent resing it. So if you're trading 6 for 6, you're going to be in an okay spot because the runner's probably going to run through this more than once. Now, positioning for this ice is actually relatively weird because it doesn't end the run, so where you want to put it is kind of interesting. It's probably better on central servers because that's taxing, and in a lot of games, runners will run central servers more often than they'll run the remote. That's not always true, but if it doesn't end the run, if it's kind of more taxing than that, central servers are generally the place to go. I've oversimplified that, but it's not the best remote ice, but sometimes it's going to be good there because it's what you have. Another really cool thing about Nightdancer, comparing it to Fairchild 3.0, which is a very easy comparison, is it can't be broken by David. And that's actually kind of a big deal, because now if an Anarch runner wants to deal with Nightdancer, they're going to be actively spending 6. And that's also another huge deal is that I'm super surprised that this isn't a Biroid, considering it's a good HP ice. And Biroids are balanced off the idea that you can click through them if you need to or if you want to. And this is a punishing face check that you can't click through. And that's a huge deal. It's also a huge deal for things like Spooned and other, well, mostly Spooned, because you can't get rid of this. You always have to break it. You have to come back with a breaker is what I'm saying. And that's kind of crazy. The value of this card also improves value of other Biroids like Ravana 1.0. If it copies these subroutines, Ravana is really good. You can click through Ravana, mind you. And also Loki in some way is actually a bit better. You can also buff this card. Things like Helheim servers, maybe you need to throw out most of your hands so the next turn you have 5 clicks so you can go score that agenda. That might be a winning play on 3rd or 4th click some turns. And also this ice is only 3. 3 influence, which means it's splashable. And this is a good piece of ice in almost any faction. I would say any faction, almost any deck. Because being able to score 4-2 out of hand is nuts. It's super nuts. Imagine you're playing a Jinteki deck. Runner's not going to generally prepare for this thing. They hit it, you spend 6. You can score an EC out of hand, you're golden. On top of that, if you're playing Jinteki, you can play Marcus Batty anyways. This ice is nuts. It's really good. With Fairchild 3.0 being out, it's so hard to respect both of these. It's one of those sort of punishing face checks that I think the meta is going to become balanced around or has to revolve around. There's a checklist of ice in my head whenever I'm playing any matchup that I go through to think like, okay, that's often they're going to play this, this, or this. What's the worst case scenario? And generally against HB right now, it's Architect, and it is Fairchild 3.0. And this probably just is higher above any of them now, and it's actually really hard to deal with. It's a really strong piece of ice for 3 influence. I would see this splashed. This is crazy. This is crazy. Art is so good too. That art is nuts. Wow. Let's move on to the next HV card. This is Jinja City grade. It's an upgrade region. We saw this one spoiled for a while, and I think a lot of people are really excited for it because it really supports a part of Netrunner a lot of people enjoy. It's 1 to res. It's a region, so only 1 region per server. And it says when you draw a piece of ice, you may reveal it and then install it, protecting this server, lowering its install cost by 4 credits. It has also a trash cost of 5, which is a fair bit, and it's also 2 influence, so it's technically easily splashable. Just a little bit of backstory. Jinja's a real place. A lot of the story of the cycle, or at least this data pack, almost entirely happens in the city of Jinja. This is in the middle of, I think technically it's Uganda. Yeah, it's Uganda. If I'm not mistaken, that's Lake Victoria. I might actually be wrong about that. I don't know why this is not clearly... Oh, it is Lake Victoria. Fantastic. And this is on the North Shore. This is this hotel here, Source of the Nile Hotel. This is the blue, or the white Nile, excuse me. The Victoria Nile is labeled here, which is what the data pack is about. And Jinja's real. Right now, it's not the bustling sort of metropolis in the Android Netrunner future that is trying to build the Beanstalk, or the new space elevator. It currently has a population of about 73,000. It looks like this. It's a real place, which I think is really cool to see this card and their imagination of the future of Uganda. So what does this card do? This card gives you economy, it saves you credits when installing ice, and it saves you clicks. It saves you a lot of clicks with installing ice. And as long as you have enough ice in your deck, you can just draw and slap it on a server for no extra cost. And the cost of installing ice on a server does get prohibitive really quickly. The first is free, the second costs 1, the third costs 2. And not only do you have to res that ice, which is going to cost money, but those install costs add up a lot. Also, one of the best things, I don't know actually anymore if that's true, but when you put more ice on a server, it obviously makes it harder to run. That was a pretty inane sentence. Who can use this? This is Architects of Tomorrow, and I was most excited for Jinja City grade as an Architects of Tomorrow player, or someone who's played this ID. And the idea with Architects of Tomorrow is that you generally need at least 2 Biroids on the board. Most of Biroids are ice, most of them. And having 2 on the table means you're always going to get your ability. And also having multiple Biroids installed on the table, specifically cheaply installed in the same remote, is also a big deal because you can click through Biroids. And so you generally need 2 Biroids in a row before your server is considered scoring safe, if you want to consider that. Another really good idea is perhaps next design. These decks generally have 20 to 22 ice in them, so it's very trivial to get card draw to make Jinja City grade good. You're still going to have to find a way how to capitalize that into a win condition. Now, it's something that you probably realize in Netrunner that just having ice on a remote, a lot of ice, is not going to win you always the game. Generally, runners have icebreakers and they have an economy, so they can always get into the remote. Having a big remote, I think this is what I was trying to say before when I got lost in that inane sentence. Having a big remote is only so good, and I think in any ID or any deck that has a really deep server, upgrades are very good. If you put Ashen in a server and now the runner has to run it twice, you multiply the value of that server, and that's a really big deal. So you might want to look into upgrades, but the value of this card increases with card draw. On its own, it's fine. If you mandatory draw, if you spend a click to draw and you get a free install, that's a really good click. But this can get really nutty in HB relatively fast, and that's because HB has access to clearances. The idea that you can play violet level clearance or even ultraviolet clearance, and you're drawing 4 to 4 cards, and you're able to install basically every piece of ice that you draw on a super server, reducing the cost. Mind you, the 5th ice only costs 1 credit, which is not too bad at all. You can build a server really quickly. And there's more draw cards that you could consider splashing into almost any deck that wants to run this, that's running a sort of Glacier strategy. The idea of Glacier, a lot of ice on a server. So you have cool draw cards, maybe 1 influence for anonymous tip is good enough. Mind you, all these cards also help you find the agenda that you want to jam into that super remote that showed out of nowhere. Advanced Concept Hopper is really cool because this lets you install ice. If the runner The timing on this is really cool. If the runner says, I'm running on this server that has 2 pieces of ice, and an advanced concept offer, you say, I'm going to draw, and you draw a piece of ice, that ice can suddenly appear on that remote the runner is running on as the 3rd outermost ice, and they're going to be approaching that one, which is a really cool surprise. This card I like a lot. It doesn't see a lot of play, but I think that helps it a lot. Other really good draw cards, Estelle Moon might not make that much sense. Any deck that runs Estelle Moon generally runs a lot of assets, so they're not running a lot of ice, so maybe this is a bit convoluted, but I could see it technically being a way to suddenly build a remote and capitalize on that Estelle draw, sort of. This is a card I like a lot more than I thought I would. Free card draw, free server, builds itself, gives you credits, that's good, and maybe Alex Talbot is good. Almost never, but if any time, please let it be now. Alex, please be good. Also, mind you, this card is only 2 influence, so if you want to go out of your way and build a Glacier Jinteki deck, actually makes a lot of sense. There's not a lot of really strong regions in Jinteki anyway that are competing for the region slot in your scoring remote. Mind you can do this on a central server, but maybe Paulina Agroplex, Paulina, that lets you draw cards, build a server, and if you want to go all in on that, maybe you want to play Political Dealings and install every card you draw and never click to install anything besides these 2 cards, and that's really fun. Also, any card that gives you draw, Eli 2.0, a card I don't really like that much, or Errand Boy, a card that I think is really fun, suddenly gives you server value. And I think this is what I was talking about before, being able to stack Biroids in front of each other is a really big deal because now the runner can't click through them. Now, the biggest problem with stacking all your ice on a remote all at once and having all this ice that suddenly appears is that you're probably not going to be able to res it, and that kind of can be an issue really quickly. And I think if any deck wants to build a remote fast, they're going to have to be able to deal with how to res all that stuff. Now, there's a lot of really cheap ice that gives you money. I don't know why I said a lot. There's basically 1 or 2. And pop-up window, maybe that's something you want to put it on a server or on any server really quickly to give you money while you're installing ice at the same time. This technically works out. But there's also a lot of cool cards. In HB, specifically if you're doing Architects of Tomorrow with Biroids, Brain Taping Warehouse gives you a lot of value because you're now able to res almost all of your ice for really cheaply as long as the runner doesn't click, which they might. Another big option here is that peak efficiency becomes really good. I've been playing a lot of Architects of Tomorrow decks that are actually really poor on economy, but then they get to free res all their ice that they put out through their ability, and then you pay peak efficiency for a lot of money. In the same way that CFC contract, excavation contract, gives you a lot of money as well once you're set up and kind of lets you recover when you go down to no credits because you're trying to res all your ice that you barely can afford. Also, a huge shout out to Seder Adaptive Barrier, which gets really good if you put a lot of ice on a server. And if there's one reason I'm sad Akatara Watanabe has rotated is because he would be so good right now in this deck. Breaker Bay Grid also, this is kind of a big deal. A lot of HB decks, specifically things like Asa Group, which I think is pretty good with Jinja Grid. With Jinja City Grid, because you can get this value install, specifically even if you draw on the runner's turn, you can get a lot of value out of that. But those decks a lot of times want to get value out of Breaker Bay Grid by installing a lot of upgrades in a scoring remote. So these are going to kind of conflict each other because regions are very limited. So you have to figure out how to deal with that. Just on the runner side, it's very important to understand that this is not only a positive thing to the corp. There are some drawbacks on it. Firstly, you're basically saying what each piece of ice that you install is, and that can't be understated of how big a deal that is. The runner knows what every piece of ice is. They can start making intelligent decisions. They know what breakers they need to know. They know how much money you have, so they know what you can res. There's no real surprises of, oh, I don't know if they can res that or not. And that's actually kind of substantial. If the runners are playing things like Femme Fatale now that Credit Kiting got printed, it's easy to target. I guess also Wari, that game in this data pack, now gets a lot easier if you know what all the ice is. Also, you can't really surprise anyone with good ice, and that might be an issue. I also brought a Mushin here just to remind me of the fact that there is some bluffing in Jinja City Grid, which is kind of cool. And that's on the basis that this card says when you draw a piece of ice, you may reveal it. Firstly, it's great that it's worded like that because that's a thing that's really hard to prove whether or not you drew an ice. But you can now draw an ice and say, no reveal. And the runner might think that you just drew an agenda into HQ and that might draw their attention there, which might be something that you want to do. You can also, yeah, I guess that's the only way that's particularly good, but that bluffing mechanic should not be understated of how cool that is. I like that a lot. Overall, this is a card that really, really boosts the idea of scoring agendas behind ice, which is something that hasn't been really strong in Netrunner for a while now, since back in the day where people played what is called a food coats deck, an ETF deck that ran a lot of Engineering the Future, and like the old HB Identity from the original core set, that was running a lot of good ice and then defensive upgrades like what's now rotated Caprice Nassé and the Ash that we talked about before. And that sort of idea of this slow glacier deck that builds a pretty difficult remote to contest hasn't really existed in Netrunner in the strong way since then, and this might push that sort of archetype forward, which is exciting to see, because I think that lines up a lot with what people believe Netrunner is from a distance, and I think a lot of people like that playstyle, so good to them. Alright, this is Aimor. Firstly, I would like to say that I don't know what Aimor means. I tried to do some research. I love finding out the flavor on these cards, and I have no idea. The best I could come up with is this sort of word means love, or that sort of like base root in a lot of languages. It also is a brand that makes like boom boxes, but yeah, I got nothing here. Flavor text on this card is also like really fun. I like it a lot. But Aimor is a zero-cost Jinteki trap ice, so it has no subtype, so it can't be broken by conventional breakers. You generally need an AI. It's of 1 strength, it's only 2 influence, and has a simple subroutine: trash the top 3 cards of the stack, then trash Aimor. We've seen a card similar to this before, Data Mine, which I think is no longer in the revised core set. Yep, where it does something bad, it trashes itself, and it's inherently hard to break. Now, I'll be honest, I really don't like this design of the card. Trash the top 3 cards of the stack it can be disastrous. It can be really disastrous, and there's not a lot of counterplay to that. This is Potential Unleashed, which is a deck that multiplies the value of net damage. And while this card doesn't do net damage, a lot of the strongest versions of Potential Unleashed decks modernly are just decks that want to grind you out. They want to do enough damage to your deck, to your hand, to some point where you have no cards, and then you can't interact with the corp due to fear of things like Snare, due to fear of things like you can't steal Obokata Protocol, and you're just basically out of the game at that point. And this is Dan Dargenio's list. He came in top 4, 3rd or 4th at Worlds. I should know this. But Jonas Wilson, I was also playing this. And if you notice this deck list, it's basically just every net damage card, every card that does somewhat unconditional damage, and then just a bunch of recursion. All the recursion, really. Preemptives, archive memories, even Wampo reclamations. And it just kind of mills the runner out, whether or not they're into it. And in the way I see it, Aimor kind of represents that sort of archetype. It's a card that's super hard to interact with. When it fires, you lose 3 cards out of your deck. If you only have 45 cards in your deck, 3 of these fire, you're out 9 cards. It's really hard to interact with a corp. That's obviously a simplification. You can break this with an AI, but it's going to be rough. It's going to be really rough, and if you just keep recurring these, eventually you're going to get ground out. There's no real intelligent decisions with this card. You just kind of put it down. It will likely fire. You'll take the top 3 cards of the deck, and that's it. Not a big fan of that. We've also seen kind of cards like this before, like with Maganga. I think this one's strictly better than Maganga. Mind you, this doesn't do net damage, so it's not going to set up like a lethal where you flatline a runner, but it's just going to grind them out. And with cards like Genotyping, we've had more recursion printed recently. You can play this a lot of times, and I'm not a big fan of it. It's also probably going to see play in Scorpio's defense system decks. The idea of trashing the top 3 cards of the stack is also a really big deal if you trash breakers and remove them from the game, which a lot of times is Scorpios' kind of a deal. You can see this also in cards like Underway Renovation as a sort of on-brand Weyland thing. I think there's also like Bloodletter, which is also a card that I wasn't excited about printing because sometimes this just fires and maybe you lose your 1 breaker and lose the game. But in Scorpios, I don't know if this is worth 2 influence. A lot of the Scorpios decks that I've seen would rather spend influence on things like Marcus Batty so that you're able to fire meaner subroutines, and this is 2 influence, which is a fair bit. So I'm not sure if this is one of the better ways to run Scorpios, but it's definitely scary. And I think actually this card's maybe not so good in a lot of ways, specifically against Anarch that have heat breakers, because sometimes you hit this thing and it just kind of puts the breakers sort of on the table, so that's rough. But yeah, this card doesn't fit into anything besides something that's trying to like trash all the cards in the runner's deck, and there's not a lot of counterplay against that besides try and play as few cards as possible, and I'm not a big fan. We'll see if this is good. We'll see if people want to recur this over and over again and you're going to keep hitting it and maybe you lose 15 cards of your deck and you had no way to deal with it, and that kind of sucks. This is Bacterial Programming. It's a 5-3 agenda. It is Jinteki. It's a research subtype, and it says when Bacterial Programming is scored or stolen, you may look at the top 7 cards of R&D. Add any number of those to HQ, trash any number of those, and then arrange the rest in any order, and then they go back on top of R&D. This is technically a defensive agenda. And defensive 5-3 agenda specifically, if you want to consider this defensive, I think it's kind of more like a utility agenda, is a big deal. 5-3 agendas have been a really bad spot in Netrunner for a really long time on the basis that if the runner hits them, they get 3 points. And 3 points is more than 2 points. Also, it generally makes the amount of agendas the runner needs to hit 7 and win the game by. They generally only need 3 agendas. Well, if you only run 2 pointers and some combination, they generally need 4. And that's a really big deal if you want to not lose. And for that reason, 3-pointers aren't played. I say this a lot. Anytime we see a 5-3 agenda, that always has to come up, is that Netrunner players are very averse to running 3-point agendas because if they're stolen, it's such a huge swing. Future Perfect was one of the most common 5-3 agendas that was played because it has a defensive ability. It protects itself in central servers, and that's a really big deal because it diminishes the impact of losing this. You don't get blown out so hard. Sometimes it saves itself. And the most popular 5-3 after that was Global Food Initiative, which is basically like a 5-2 when stolen, and that is a really, really big deal. Now, this is cool. I'm not sure if this will be played still. On the basis, that 5-3s are very scary, that a lot of corps are averse to playing them. A really big thing about this agenda, though, is that its ability fires when it's stolen. And that's such a big deal, and it's something I wish we saw way sooner in Netrunner. NBN agendas are kind of all over the place, and we saw this one come out in the last cycle, and this is a 5-3 agenda with a really weird utility ability, but if this one was worded the same way, if this fired when scored or stolen, I think this card might be considered playable in some decks at least, and it's a real shame that we haven't seen this earlier, because it just makes 5-3 agendas just more playable. Also, I haven't noticed this, and if you've been watching this channel for a while, you know the last Red Sand cycle was kind of a shit show because of templating. How did they possibly forget the colon between the word agenda initiative? Like, is this not a template? This cycle has been good so far. So what does this card do when stolen? I'm going to talk about when stolen. When scored is good too. When scored, it does all the same stuff. But when stolen, I think is probably a bigger deal. And we break it into 3 sides. You can look at the top cards of R&D and add any number of them to HQ. And that's a really big deal. You can look at 7 cards. That's a lot of cards. And then bring to hand whatever you need right now. And sometimes that's money. Sometimes you just need a celebrity gift. Sometimes you just need economy now. And if you could lose this in the early game, at least you're going to have a good hand going forward. And that's a big deal. Sometimes you need ice. You can put ice in hand that you need to maybe ice up R&D because you didn't turn 1. And that's also a big deal. Sometimes you also just need things to capitalize on board state right now, and Neural EMP is probably not the best example, but probably the best example is Punitive Counterstrike. If the runner has just scored and stolen, a 5-3 agenda, Punitive Counterstrike looks really good. Double Punitive will kill a lot of runners as long as you have the right money. So it's not that difficult maybe to get 1 econ card and Punitive, and maybe you had our Punitive in hand. Another option is also pull back an archive memory, so it's Punitive, Archive, Punitive. That actually is maybe an archetype on its own. Punitive Jinteki has already been okay for a long time, largely because Obokata Protocol is like really good with punitive counterstrikes. And this is a card that helps you set up those combos that you need multiple cards and gives them at the right specific time where you want them. Another option I don't think is just as good as maybe Hunter Seeker. If they stole an agenda, this is a nice time to pull that off, and that's for sure. Also, this fires when the runner is accessing. So say they're multi-accessing HQ. If they steal the Bacterial Programming and they're going to access 2 more cards in HQ, you can pull cards into HQ that they now have to access from. So you can pull in snares. And suddenly a snare shows up in HQ and maybe that's lethal. And that's kind of cool as long as you can find it. And I think that's awesome. Same thing for R&D. If they're multi-accessing R&D, I think we have some things open here to talk about that. How it works, say you see 3 cards. The first one's Bacterial Programming. You can now do your Bacterial Programming, and whatever cards you put top of the deck, those next 2 cards will be accessed. And you can choose what those are. So maybe double snare, GG. Who knows? Now this card also lets you throw out cards, which is not immediately a very exciting thing, but there's a lot of really good ways to get use out of that. Industrial Genomics is better the more face-down cards they are in archives, and cards you throw out with Bacterial Programming, cards that you trash, will be face down. And that's a huge deal. If the runner steals this, maybe the trash cost of everything goes up by 7. And that clearly can be a big deal. This is the UFAC, and you might want to actually give this a read because this is absolutely fascinating, and we're going to take too long explaining what this is, but how it works when bacterial programming is stolen from archives, and then you add cards to archives of what you can access and what you can flip over. Definitely worth a read. Check it out. It's kind of wild. Another really cool Jinteki thing is that you can now throw your breached domes into archives. Sometimes that's good. Also, maybe you have some ice. Remember that vanilla we talked about before? Maybe it's mid to late game and you don't want to draw a vanilla off of R&D, so you can throw it out, and that's a big deal. Now, the last part of this is you get to rearrange the top of R&D. That's huge. You know what you're going to draw, so you know if you need to protect R&D, you know it's going to come up, and you can plan your next turns, and that's a really big deal. We used to see effects like this in Precognition, which is no longer in the revised core set, sadly. Not that this card was that popular, but that sort of Jinteki, I see the future, a Nisei idea is really cool and alive and well. You also have really easy synergy with Mutate, which is dope. You can set it up so that now that vanilla we talked about for the third time can become a Chiashi, kind of trivially. And here we're talking about Maker's Eye turning wheel into snare. That's huge. That's a really big deal. And this card gives you a lot of flexibility. And if you want to play a 5/3 that helps you set up, that helps you accelerate, that helps punish the runner, it's a really cool thing. Now here we have to insert the mandatory thing that we insert every time a cool 5/3 is printed in the game, let alone a defensive or offensive 5/3, which there are a lot of. And that's a really big deal right now, than any time in Netrunner, is that there's so many reasons why you should run Film Critic. Film Critic is a card that you put on the table, requires very little thought outside of that. It costs very little influence, very little tempo to install. It's 1 credit. And then it turns off so many things. And there's so many reasons why runners are playing this in the competitive scene more than any other restricted card. Mind you, this card is restricted. And that's because every faction right now has a real good target for Film Critic. Jinteki, we already have Obokata Protocols. If these are popular too, let alone Future Perfect, that's kind of nuts. Weyland has Hunter Seeker and Punitive Counterstrike. HB has Lakshmi Smart Fabrics, and NBN has things like Quantum Predictive Model. This card is super popular right now, and I wish this card wasn't printed exactly. I wish it was more nuanced. I wish there's more counterplay. Largely, there isn't. If you ask me whether or not I want to play Bacterial Programming this week in Netrunner, I would say no, but that's because most of my opponents are playing Film Critic, and that kind of sucks because it makes this a blank 5/3 that they spend 2 clicks whenever they want to steal, and that's kind of a bummer. Now, there are other ways to deal with this if you don't have Film Critic or you don't want to spend your restricted or influence on it. Jinteki has Imp and By Any Means. Those are more interesting cards. I like card designs like that are more counterable as opposed to somewhat a permanent connection. Again, there's way to deal with this. Voter Intimidation in Jinteki. You sometimes have Wake Up Call and then even Snatch and Grab if you have the credit differential. So if you do see a Film Critic, maybe you can deal with it. But it's definitely an interesting 5/3, and the Punitive Jinteki was already pretty okay. So I'm excited to see what people can do with this. And this is Jua. It's our first NBN card. It's a Sentry. It costs 2 to res, 3 strength. And it says when the runner encounters Jua, he or she cannot install cards for the remainder of the turn. That's a pretty cool effect. And it has it has a single subroutine. It says choose 2 installed runner cards. A Fable. The runner must add 1 of those cards to the top of the stack. It's only 2 influence as well. And a bit of a backstory, or at least some information. Jua is Swahili. It means sun. It also seems to mean the verb to know, or it's part of the verb to know. Jua Kali is actually a pretty common expression. It literally translates to hot sun. I've heard some translations mean get her done. Or in Kenyan, it's a mass noun, a small scale craft or artisanal work, such as making tools or textiles. This whole idea of the hot sun makes a lot of sense when you read the flavor text. It wasn't until the spots cleared that I realized half of my rig was gone. Staring too long into the sun might be an issue. So this idea of like bouncing installed cards has been really an NBN thing, and we've seen this with Archangel. Our Archangel's really cool. It works on Axis, which is very scary, and it bounces a single card. Now, this is hard to break, but you can always trace it. But this is different. It's easy to break, but you can't trace through it. So if you hit this, it's always going to fire, and that's an issue. Now, the cool thing about this design is actually like very devilish. If the runner hits this early in the game, or early in the turn, the rest of their turn they can't install. So they either have to run, or click for credits, or draw. That's it. They can't do anything, but if they want to install things early in the turn and then run to play around the on-encounter ability, then Jua will always fire as long as the subroutine fires, and then one of those cards is going to be returned. And mind you, it's not going to be returned to grip like Archangel, it's going to be returned to the top of the stack, which is actually a significantly bigger tempo hit, on the basis that you also have to draw that card and then reinstall it if you want. That in some ways does play poorly with cards like, what's it called, Salem's Hospitality, because it's not directly in hand just yet, but you know it will be. But that's forcing the runner to have to draw the top card. We've also seen this with Data Loop, right? It's actually like a pretty significant tempo hit. And I'm trying to think early game against Jinteki, what do you install before you run? And a lot of times, I don't know if you install this early in the turn, and maybe this is a reason, because that's the thing, it's like, I don't know whether you install early or you install late when face checking against Jinteki anymore. If you put down your liberated accounts, you put down your daily cast and you run, you have to return one of those to the top of your deck. That's really bad for the runner. It's also choose to install runner cards if able, so if you install one card and run, you're actually kind of safe, as long as you're okay with not installing another card, but that's actually really scary. There's also a really cool synergy with this card in Caligo to Real TV if you want to go down that path, which is a lot of things. Now the thing that's like made me a bit unsure about this card is if you look at like current, at least competitive, controlling the message decks perhaps, you look at their ice suite, and their ice suite is kind of elegant, right? You have a lot of like end the run ice, specifically end the run ice that is either taxing when they're tagged, like has value when they're tagged. It has big end the run code gate, and then really taxing ice. With Data Raven, which helps protect your quantum predictive models and so forth. So it's hard to take this sort of shell and slap this card into here, because this card doesn't specifically end the run, but it is definitely a taxing card. And if you notice, I don't know if this fits in there. So I think if this is going to fit into any deck, we haven't quite figured it out, or it might be wildly different than anything else. Mind you, some decks like this, some competitive NBN controlling the message decks classically did play Cobra, and maybe Cobra is worse than ever because of Anarchs, because of things like MK Ultra, which if they trashed, or it's really not that big of a deal. But looking at this, I'm trying to figure it out. Like, what do you install before you run, or do you install after you run? And if you install after you run, you're going to be in a bad spot. So I think that's actually really fascinating, and I need to see more how this one plays out. Even like taking a heat breaker and putting it on top of the stack instead of trashing it is actually really good for you, because they have to draw it and reinstall it. Now, mind you, this is an on-encounter ability, which is a very NBN thing, so Hunting Grounds does help you with that, but I don't actually think that's that big of a liability, considering this is NBN and they have much better on-encounter ice that you probably want to use that on. At the end of the day, also, this costs, if you're playing Anarch, a lot of times this is going to cost you 3 credits to break, and that's not cheap. And that's definitely cheaper than having this fire, but like 3 credits for a 2-cost sentry is not bad at all. And that's going to keep you off. I don't know why I brought this up. Oh, I think it's because of the next card. Yeah, this is Jua. This is actually a really fascinating piece of ice. I'm a big fan. It reminds me in some ways of Tribunal, but is a lot cheaper. And this card was played in some decks. This is Threat Assessment. Threat Assessment is a reprisal, which is a new subtype that we're seeing in specifically the cycle so far. I believe we might be getting one for each faction. This is the second we've seen. We've seen the Weyland one. So it's an operation, costs 1 to play. It's called Threat Assessment, and it says play only if the runner trashed at least 1 corp card during their last turn. That's what a reprisal is. And it says choose an installed runner card. The runner must either add that card to the top of the stack or take 2 tags. Then you have to go ahead and remove Threat Assessment from the game instead of trashing it, which is fantastic. I think punishing cards like this, really strong cards, well, at least let's call them punishing cards, I like that they can't be recurred endlessly, because that would be an issue. I think FFG is doing a lot to learn. They have to limit recursion. So this only fires if you trash a card. And how many NBN decks is that going to be something that you'll be counting on the runner doing? I think a fair bit. Again, this is controlling the message, a very common competitive NBN identity. And this deck generally functions on having really good assets that are inherently protected by their ID ability, and then perhaps even things like this. There's a lot of these in controlling the message decks, which even if the runner hits this, they'll trash it, and it's not entirely their choice. So Threat Assessment is not going to be hard to play. There's going to be a lot of opportunities to play this thing, I believe. Mind you, this is not only assets, it's any turn, so if Ice Destruction comes back in a big way, this is really strong. Now, this is what's called a Punisher card, and Punisher cards is a term that comes from Magic the Gathering, and it's a card that gives the opponent choices. So this card is only as good as the worst choice in most cases, and I think this card almost you could consider not to be a Punisher card in most cases, because the runner cannot afford to take 2 tags on the corpse turn. You can't. You really can't. If this was terminal, you could, but the fact that it's not terminal and that you can play this and then do two things while the runner is tagged, 2 more clicks, means you almost always have to take the card and put it on the top of the stack. Why can't you take 2 tags? Well, there's things like Boom. I don't think that's this popular anymore, but I think the bigger reason is in NBN, it's trivial for them to play cards like Exchange of Information, which is a huge swing for a deck that runs 3-pointers and 1-pointers, let alone cards like Closed Accounts. And if you lose all your money or lose agendas, you can lose the game. So I think almost always with this card, you're going to have to take a card to the top of the stack unless you are Tag Me. And that's... is that a big deal? Is it worth putting a card slot in your deck that says take a card that the runner's installed and put it on top of your stack? And I don't entirely know, because card slots are generally really tight, at least in competitive decks. Are there good targets for this? I'm not sure. Anything really expensive is a really big deal. Security Nexus and Maw might actually become more popular if we've talked about only specifically the Atom card from the last pack. Or also credit kiting too, if maybe bigger breakers are coming out more often. There's also some really cool meta targets, things like Net Mercure with all the credits on them. That's a really big deal. Bouncing this when it has 7 stealth credits on it is huge. Even like a loaded turning wheel can be a big deal. Also, like bouncing the heat breakers again, like we talked about before, is really good. It slows them down. They don't have to draw them and install them, and maybe that gives you the scoring window you need. Also, again, Caligo to Real TV gets kind of spicy. This is also like a thing that you can play kind of easily in Weyland. We've seen this archetype again before. Maybe you want to play Threat Assessment and then Underway Renovation Advance, or just Single Advance. That's kind of goofy, but you can do it. And I think this card basically you say 1 credit to return a card to the top of the stack, which does sound good. Now, a lot of times cards like this that like specifically target single cards, and mind you, that's actually a really big thing to say about Jua, is that because you're choosing 2 installed runner cards, it's again a Punisher, and the runner gets the choice of which one to put on top of their stack. So they're always going to pick the one that's worse for you. And a lot of times in NBN, you want targeted removal. Say that you're trying to kill the runner or something like that. And you see cards like this and you want to remove them. This kind of helps you do it, but not entirely, because then you still need to tag the runner and kill them. We also saw a card in the last pack that is strictly better tag punishment. Like this, these cards are very similar. That's also a reason why you never take the 2 tags, because if they have this, I don't know. It's an interesting card. It kind of is cool. If they're tag me, I think it does absolutely nothing, which sucks. But if they're not tagging me, it returns a card to the top of their stack. I think by far the best part of this card is that there's like text underneath on the HUD of this, what I'm assuming is a drone. And you can actually read it when you blow it up this big at the 600 DPI scan. And it says, I have to add some important information about the character. What this information would be interesting should go here, but now I'm writing this in order to fill this space. It's like filler text that the artist wrote, and I don't know whether they intended to change it or they thought it was too small to read it. But if you can read it, it's actually really funny. I think they said they're like writing nonsense. Yeah. This is economic warfare. Here, let's close a bunch of these tabs. This is Economic Warfare, and it's a card that we saw for a while coming. It was one of the first cards that was spoiled in marketing information, and I'm actually kind of dreading this card. It's 0 to play. It's a Grey Ops operation in Weyland, and it says play only if the runner made a successful run during their last turn. The runner loses 4 credits of Able. It's only 2 influence. Just a fun little thing, Duka Lemefungwa is Swahili for the store is closed, which shouldn't make sense. Should make sense, excuse me. I was hoping that was something to do with frozen yogurt. So this card is similar to one other card we've seen before, which is load testing. And these are cards that don't specifically do much to help you, right? Like, I think someone could see load testing or economic warfare as a card that you play in a way that's like, okay, well, now the runner has 1 less click, the runner has 4 less credits, so it's harder for them to contest a remote server or something like that. For load testing, you need clicks sometimes to deal with biroids. For economic warfare, you need money for just about everything else. And these cards are never played like that. They're almost never played like that because the card slot is just not good enough. So they're generally played in some degenerate way, in a really degenerate way. Either some combo or in some combination that's going to be not a lot of fun for most, at least the runner. So half of the players. Now, load testing did evolve into this ridiculous combo, and I've played this on the channel before, where with enough cards like Clone Suffrage Movement, you could recur load testings almost endlessly, and there was actually a deck that said the runner had no turn for the rest of the game. And luckily, Clone Suffrage Movement did rotate out. But economic warfare kind of, in some ways, has that sort of threat attached to it. The idea is that if the runner has to run, mind you, so that does make this a bit more forgiving. But if the runner has no money, all they do is click for credits, and if they run, and maybe there's some massive recursion, which doesn't currently exist, maybe the next turn they lose 8 credits, and now they're back to turn 1. And as long as you can keep recurring this, and that's a really big deal, is I would assume a card like this would be printed saying, remove from game after playing, because it's that sort of kind of really bullshit recursion spam. This might be an issue card like threat assessment potentially, but it's doesn't say that, which scares me. Now, fortunately, Clone Suffrage Movement isn't in the game anymore, so there's only certain cards that can recur kind of reliably. Satyr Laboratories is one of them. Maybe every time you lose a click in Satyr, you lose 4 credits as well. Now the runner or the corp also loses a click themselves, but that seems kind of brutal. It's not particularly good with Archive Memories, that's too slow, but Ramen Rai is also maybe a bit too slow, but this is kind of what we have. So right now, I don't think economic warfare recursion can strictly be an issue in like the infinite loop way. So I'm glad at least we solved that, but this card is still really punishing. I think the biggest combo with this card is Brian Stinson. And Brian Stinson has been pulling his weight so heavily in the last, couple months since like revised core set. He used to be a joke largely because runner economy was so good back in the days of things like Temujin Contract, but runner economy has kind of slowed down. Now, how you play against Brian Stinson is you keep enough credits. As long as you just keep enough credits, you have to keep 6 or more. The idea that the corp can now suddenly make you lose 4 credits so that they're under Brian Stinson value so they can suddenly fly ahead might actually be a really big deal. It might. But it's not only that. There's a lot of things in Netrunner at like high calibers of play or at any caliber of play where it's a very fine calculation of saying, okay, I have to respect certain things. And now this card goofs it up. And admittedly, this card goofs it up in a similar way to things like just having a hedge fund in hand, the corpse sitting on a hedge fund, but actually a lot stronger. This is hard-hitting news. And if you play a hedge fund suddenly, maybe you have more credits than the runner expected and you can hit them with the hard-hitting news. But as long as the runner has more than 8 credits, no matter how much money the corp has, you can generally clear all the tags. Now, if you have less than 8 credits, you can't do that anymore. So now, like, a turn such as economic warfare, hard-hitting news is brutal. And there are very few ways to deal with it. On another way, C-Source is kind of a big deal. It's not as big of a deal because having the 8 credit minimum, just like having the 6 credit minimum from Brian Stinson, is such a bigger deal with hard-hitting news. Now the math is off with this, where economic warfare into C-Source into closed accounts can be a really big deal. Even annoying things like door-to-door economic warfare is not going to be a lot of fun, and it's just going to put runners, like, it's the sort of card that encourages the runner to be stuck at 0 credits and not be able to interact with the corp, because as soon as they interact with the corp, there's more economic warfare, more C-Source, and more hard-hitting news, and I don't like that. I really am worried about that, because there's not much you can do about that besides, like, sit back and click for credits until you're ready to interact with the corp. That's not fun Netrunner. That really isn't fun Netrunner. I'm also pretty sure whenever cards like this come out that there's going to be some, again, we've talked about dumb combos, but like I'm kind of convinced in some way, and maybe you're spending too much influence on this and you don't have a win condition, but it's probably not terrible to like start spamming these in Cerebral Imaging just to like, with Jeeves maybe to get extra value, maybe with Biotic Labor, I don't know, just to get Brian Stinson to fire so you can get like value ultraviolet clearances. Like, having a free ultraviolet clearance with Brian Stinson is maybe worth spending card slots on this. Probably not the most competitive tier 1 CI deck, but it's gonna exist. And it's not gonna be fun, and it's gonna run hard-hitting news and boom as well. And that scares the shit out of me. I really don't like that. Like, do you localize product line for these even? Because that's a big thing, is like, I don't even think it matters how much money the corp spends doing this. If the runner's at 0 credits, they can no longer interact with you as long as you have appropriate threats. And that does exist already with things like C-Source and hard-hitting news, or C-Source closed accounts, I suppose, but this goofs with the math. Also, reversed accounts. Like, that was a big deal. Like, people are spending influence and time on reversed accounts in CI. I guess that's simpler. Look, if there's two cards, one says gain 4 credits, one says make the other turn lose 4 credits, one of them is going to be inherently more of a fun play experience. I don't know. I really don't. I'm not excited for this one because it punishes you for putting it in the deck. And again, this is not going to be used. And I don't expect the designers of Netrunner to expect to see this card to be used in a way like, oh, you lose 4 credits, I have a scoring window, right? Like maybe you need money to commit to break my Hadrian's Wall. Like I don't think that's going to honestly happen. But yeah. Oh boy. Anyways, this is economic warfare. It might be coming a lot. I don't know. I honestly don't know. Because card slots are really tight, right? And maybe this is not even worth a card slot. Probably isn't. Let's hope that's the case. This is Force Connection, which is a cool Weyland card. It's cost 0. It's an upgrade and an ambush, one of the most fun subtypes in Netrunner. And it says if you access this from R&D, you have to reveal it. And when the runner accesses Force Connection, you got to do Trace 3. And if successful, the runner gets 2 tags. This doesn't fire from archives, and it's a measly 0 credits to trash. It's also 2 influence. So it's an ambush that gives tags. And that's cool. We've only seen that once before in TGTBT. Mind you, this is also an upgrade, so you can proper install it, and there's a lot of value in that. But this also fires from R&D, and this is a card that can only be played inside yellow. Now with 2 influence, you could play this in yellow if you want, and there's actually some pretty cool combos with that. Making News makes this a Trace 5, which is kind of substantial. Now, I think that might be a bit of you might be chasing the wrong rabbit at that point, because even if you spend 4 or 5 boosting this trace, it's better than spending 4 credits and 2 clicks removing the tags. So the runner's actually very much incentivized to boost this trace. So you're going to have to boost by a lot to make the runner spend the clicks and the credits, because again, I think if you spend 6 on this, you're breaking even, because you could just click for 2 credits next to clicks, right? Sync makes it a bit harder, it makes the calculation even more. I think the runner will just spend more on this. I guess value with AR enhanced security is cool if you get this on the table, and if you trash, you take tags, and if you trace, you take tags, and that's all real good. Now, as a Weyland card, or as any tag punishment, how bad is having 2 tags on an ambush? And it's honestly, that's kind of a problem right now with Weyland, is it's not that bad of a deal. If you run into this last click, if you're running a Weyland into Weyland, specifically a Weyland trap deck, last click, you're kind of goofing it, because there's other cards that punish you heavily, mostly things like Snare that leave you with a tag and less cards in hand, and that might be an issue. But what's the worst that can happen? If you do keep the 2 tags, yeah, boom is 100% an issue. So I think as long as you have more, if you have less credits than the corp, don't run last click. In fact, probably just run second click. Because having 1 tag is really bad. And having 1 tag, there are ways to capitalize on that. Exchange of information is a big deal. In Weyland, you have 3-point agendas. You also have 0-point agendas, let alone a fair bit of 1-point agendas. So having that swing is probably worth your time. This is also the sort of faction that has consulting visits. So being able to like pull out your exchange of information or your closed accounts if the runner does end their turn with 1 tag is actually a really big deal. You have also other cool stuff like Zealous Judge, which if the runner takes 2 tags when they run R&D, now they have this weird hard option, as long as the trace is hard enough, of, oh shit, they res the Zealous Judge. So do I run the Zealous Judge and clear 1 tag if I have the clicks? Or do I just clear the 2 tags and force them to Zealous Judge me? And that's actually really interesting. And I think this is the basis of like perhaps Argus trap decks becoming a reasonable thing. You also have dedicated response team, which is actually way harder than it looks to get that to work. When I started playing Netrunner, this was actually a really fun, popular archetype. This is the Cambridge Personal Evolution deck, and it's a deck that runs a lot of agendas, a lot of net damage cards, but it's not the sort of spammy inevitability Jinteki decks that we've been seeing with Potential Unleashed. This is a lot of traps, and the runner has to run the right ones. You're trying to set up kills with Snare, you're trying to fork the runner. It's like all the good old Yomi mind game stuff that a lot of Netrunner players like. And I think we're getting to a point where we just have almost enough cards to make that in an Argus security deck. The biggest problem is that I don't think there's enough really strong tag punishment, let alone single tag punishment in Weyland. Big deal is that we did lose Scorched Earth from the core set, so 1 tag is honestly not that big of a deal anymore, while 2 tags is a big deal, but you have enough traps. Price tag is really cool. Contract Killer actually can set up weird lethals. I think Reconstruction Contract does breathe some life into that sort of, that sort of archetype. The idea that even, I think in some weird ways you can like fire Contract Killer, get tokens on this, fire another Contract Killer, and like do some really weird chaining of things. if these all stay on the table. You also have Mr. Stone, KP Lin. Look, these are all the Weyland cards, right? They're interesting. They're definitely interesting. And I think we're 1 or 2 cards away from that. I think Weyland just needs more advanceable cards that are good or bad, whether or not the runner hits them. We're starting to see that in other factions. We saw Gene Splicer. And I think we're just 1 or 2 cards away from that archetype being like pretty fun. But this is a definitely good start. It's an upgrade. It's non-unique. You can stack all of them in one server, have some fun, play some traps. All right, we just got 3 neutral cards to go. This is SSL Endorsement. It's a 5/3 agenda initiative. It's neutral, and it says when SSL Endorsement is scored or stolen, there we go, that's new Netrunner. Place 9 credits on the bank from it. When the corp's turn begins, they may take 3 credits from the endorsement, and this ability is active even when SSL Endorsement is in the runner score area. So if the runner steals this, you're still going to get 9 credits slowly, and that's huge. This is a very vanilla 5/3 in the same way corporate sales team was, but this gives you 10 credits, this gives you 9 credits, but you don't care who scores it. And that's a really big deal. I think this is the right direction we need for 5/3s, that they're good regardless. I like the idea that the runner reveals some really big agenda, and I think, oh cool, I have 3 points, but also that's kind of bad for me. And I think that's a really cool way to balance 5/3 agendas, because currently they've only been balanced on they have good effects when scored. But the problem is you'll lose them. So I'm excited to see this sort of design. We've talked about this before. Again, also really good with punitive Counter-Strike. It gives you 3 credits at least as a boost, so it's kind of like an Explodapalooza, which you spell like that. It also helps with other things like C-Source, but so be it. Everything else does. A really subtle thing about this card is it says when the corpse turn begin, you may take the credits, which means you can leave them there whenever you want. That's actually maybe a big deal if you're playing around things like Tapworm. Maybe you want to specifically play around Beth, Kilrain, Chang. These are edge cases, mind you. Also, if we ever do get a new account siphon, sometimes leaving money on this is the right play. But I think it's really cool. It's really flexible. It's a good 5/3. Again, this card exists, and that's like the biggest bummer. Any card like that they print like this, that's a cool agenda, I'm probably not gonna play because Film Critic exists, and I hate that so much. This card is too little influence, too little credits, it's too easy to use. This is also technically a target for 24/7 News Cycle if you want 9 credits. Okay, this is NGO Front, and this card actually made a pretty big splash in my Netrunner community. A lot of people are talking about this. I think a lot of people are excited about this card. It embodies the sort of, you can advance this and it'll be good. You can, like, no matter what, you win with this card, and it advances and it looks like an agenda, and that's a really exciting part of Netrunner. People love bluffing in Netrunner. I got a bit ahead of myself. It's a 0-cost asset, it's neutral. It says it can be advanced, NGO Front, and you trash it with 1 host advancement token to gain 5 credits, or you trash it with 2 advancement tokens on it to gain 8 credits. Who knew nonprofits could be so profitable? And it's only 1 to trash, which is a bit of a bummer. So we saw this in the last data pack. This is another card that I think the same kind of people like both of these. I know a lot of players love Gene Splicer, the idea that, oh, it's like a trap, but if they don't run it, it's still good for me. And NGO Front is basically that as well. And we're seeing a lot more of that in Netrunner, which is exciting because what's that advanced card is a really big part of this game that you don't see, at least on the competitive side of stuff. So is this a good money card? Well, this card does 2 things. Firstly, it poses like an agenda so that the runner has to go probably maybe run it and spend credits and time breaking through your ice to find out at the last minute when you say, would you like to access? And they say yes, you say res, trash, gain 8. Haha. And that's really cool. Now, how much money does this give you? Is it a really good econ card? Is this a card that you can install advance, and fire immediately? There's no real reason to do that. You might as well wait. How much money does it give you? And you spend 3 clicks and 2 credits. So that's about 4 credits. Maybe, actually, no, that's like what? 5 credits to give yourself 8, right? No, that's wrong. Install advance. So you're spending 2 credits and install where you could have clicked for 3 credits. So it's kind of, instead of taking 3, this is a better way of doing it. Instead of taking 3 credits on your turn, that your turn could have been credit, you do install advance. So you spent 2 to gain 8. So you gain 6. It's twice as good as clicking for 3 credits. That doesn't seem that bad at all. And we've seen a card like this before. This is Thomas Haas. Thomas Haas, if you compare these two, is pitiful. Not only is the return on advancements so bad compared to this, but also he's 1 to res. Just because, yeah, the design of the old cards, specifically creation and control, wasn't very kind to HB. I mean the design of all the cards The old cards, they were kind of below power curve because they were kind of worried about pushing things, but this seems better. Now, there's a lot of decks that this is really good. Any deck that has a lot of strong 5/3s, even you can parade this around like it's a 4/2. Install Advance is still pretty fine. Any deck that you expect a lot of 5/3s, I'm expecting this a lot in decks like Paulina, that you know there's Obakatas, you know there's Future Perfects. This seems like a really good fit. I also like if this gets to be a popular card, does expose effects get better? And I know we're having an upcoming expose criminal, so maybe these two play around, but like, are people gonna start putting infiltration in their deck? I highly doubt it, but expose gets better. Maybe more like tempo positive, technically versions like drive-by, maybe that's where you need to go. I've also seen a lot of people compare this to Melange Mining Corp, which I think is interesting, and how that kind of fits up is up to you. Melange Mining Corp you can install, but the runner needs to run it in a lot of cases. Maybe not always. It's very click intensive. It's also one to trash, but these are kind of similar ideas of something I'm going to jam in a remote that should like pressure the corporation to run. And that can be a big deal. Now this card gets even better if you just want to go for mad value. If you can get advancement tokens on it for free, but it's kind of difficult. I don't think this really works well with Tenant Institute. Because if you got free tokens on this, you could have just scored a 4th-2 agenda, and that probably would be better. Maybe that's low risk, but I don't get it. I guess Pad Factory, but I don't think the thing you want about this card is the free value. I think the thing you want about this card is that it's a cool bait that gives you money. Also, big thing about this card is that you can pop it during a run, right? So you could be sitting on 1 credit, 2 credits after you install advance this. Maybe you're playing a trap deck, and the runner runs a piece of ice, and suddenly you gain 8, and then you res a big piece of ice, and you punish them. That's a really exciting Netrunner. And now every time I see install advance, and the corp has, I'm doing calculations based off how much money the corp has and how much ice they have, you have to think like, oh shit, am I going to be C-Source next turn? Can they res the big ice? And that's actually kind of interesting. Now, mind you, there are counters to this card. Councilman makes it really dumb as long as you run it because you can de-res it. Same with Interdiction. So the install advance just becomes bad. Councilman is surprisingly unpopular. Interdiction is a bit more popular on the basis that it's a current, but these don't get played that much. Now, again, this card's very similar to Gene Splicer, and lo and behold, when I was pulling this together on the Tuesday night, there's a deck, Weston Odom's deck, that came first in a San Francisco Bay Area Championship, and this is the idea of the deck, right? Definitely defensive remotes, defensive upgrades, mind you, a lot of agendas, a lot of 5/3 agendas, and then just a bunch of Gene Splicers and a bunch of NGO fronts, and almost every turn you can do install advance, and no matter what, it's going to be good for you, and that's kind of a big deal. It's a cool card. It really is kind of an interesting card. I don't know why I have Turning Wheel here. I had something to say about Turning Wheel. I don't know. This is the last card. We're almost there. Distract the Masses. It's an operation. It says the runner gains 2. Trash up to 2 cards from HQ, then shuffle 2 cards from Archives into R&D. Then go ahead and remove Distract the Masses from the game instead of trashing it. So recursion's being removed from the game. That's a thing we've seen, and we're going to continue seeing, and I like that. One of the biggest things about rotation for Netrunner is that we lost Jackson Howard, and a lot of people cried foul and said the game's going to be impossible to play without Jackson Howard. And I was one of those people that was dreading Jackson Howard not being around, and I will admit that the game is not as bad without Jackson Howard as I thought it would be, or not as heavily decided by bad hands and bad mulligans. Mind you, I do mulligan much more conservatively than I ever have, but things haven't been that bad. I think the worst case is against gang sign decks. You can get really frustrated because there's very little you can do around this card. Luckily, it's restricted, but still. Now, we've seen other cards since Jackson's rotated like Preemptive Action, and the biggest difference between these two cards, this is Terminal. This one actually lets you deal with Agenda Flood. The idea that you're holding a hand of agendas, it's very hard to throw them into Archives and then preemptive them. That's 2 turns, and one of the turns is super risky, while this gives you the Corp 2 credits and lets you get rid of things, which is pretty great. Now, that's the weird thing, is that most of the decks that I've seen right now miss Jackson Howard mostly actually because of the draw. Crazy enough, it's because of the draw I've been finding, is that I want to draw faster and sometimes you just don't find your agendas. More decks right now have strategies to be able to deal with agendas when they have them, and I like that a lot better. HQ pressure is a lot better because of this too, so you want to get things out of there. That I think Distract the Masses is not as appealing as it might be if it was announced right at the same time Jackson Howard was rotating a couple months ago. And I just don't find myself needing a card slot to do recursion in most decks. And that's kind of the problem with this card is in most decks. Because we've seen other recursion, cards like Genotyping. This is another card that removes itself from the game. And I'm really scared about this sort of card Again, because of decks like this that we talked about before. The potential unleash deck that wants to just like mill you out. They want to play enough net damage cards, unconditional damage cards, things like Hokusai and Neural EMP and so forth, to the point where you have no deck left. And it seems to me like the kind of decks, Aimor is probably a good example, the kind of decks currently that are like jamming all the recursion cards into their decks are the sort of decks that like are recurring, kind of like the less fun parts of Netrunner, what people call like the negative or the degenerate play space. That they don't need these cards to deal with agenda flood, but they need them because they're recurring these power cards that were like kind of not fun to deal with, or really bad once you can spam a lot of them. Like, I don't think it's going to be a really big deal with economic warfare, but that's sort of the idea. Mind you, you're giving the runner 2 credits. But that sort of giving 2 credits doesn't matter if you're like, what your deck is trying to do is just like make the runner have no cards left. So I don't even think that's like a really big deal. That being said, if you do have a combo deck and you need to get things rid of HQ, mind you, trash up to 2 cards means you can trash no cards. So you can just play this as like a preemptive action that shuffles 2 that isn't terminal. It gives the runner 2 credits, but like that's arguably, I don't know, maybe that's just as good. Also, it's industrial genomics. Trashing 2 cards from HQ, maybe that's good. And recurring industrial genomics is good because you can recur like neurals and stuff. But yeah, I'm like totally surprised. Recursion hasn't been an issue, and the decks that are spamming recursion are generally like acid spam decks, Gagarin. They've been also like net damage spam decks. And the decks that are like, you know, doing ice and all that sort of stuff generally don't need these cards. So I'm not that excited about this one. Theme's really cool though. And that's it. That's the whole pack. It's been quite a pack. Like, really quite a pack. There's a lot of really good stuff in here. It's a shame 5-3 agendas have to be prefaced with, oh yeah, Film Critic is a thing, and let alone Film Critic is super popular in a competitive field, but Nightdancer's great. I think Jinja's going to bring a lot of life into an archetype that needs a bit more life. Jua's interesting. I think this card probably won't see that much play, but targeted removal to the top of the stack definitely has to be good. If people are playing a lot of Security Nexus in your meta, just put this in. It'll be fun. And this one's a good one. That's great. NGO Front's also maybe a big deal. Maybe. I don't know. Oh yeah, I remember why that turning wheel was there. This is one to trash. Don't underestimate how bad that is. That being said, if you're install advancing, and remote, they maybe can't run R&D that much. Anywho, that's all for this data pack. If there's any cool interactions, what decks are you excited to play? We're going to be playing, I actually don't know if I can say that. We're going to be streaming at least with these new cards. I'm excited for that. I don't know how much gameplay we're going to get on YouTube outside of streaming. I'm going to try because these cards are really exciting. I want to do that sort of stuff. But let me know what sort of decks you're excited to do. Let me know what I got wrong. Let me know what I missed in the comments. I check and we'll be responding to all of those. And thanks so much for watching. Ciao.